right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Blooms and Barnacles podcast, where we talk about all things related to James Joyce's Ulysses. I'm Kelly, your host, and I am over the moon to be here with these fantastic guests tonight to talk about the very building in which we are seated. And so I'll go from left to right. I am very excited to welcome Robert Nicholson, former curator of the James Joyce Tower Museum, Vivien, Veale, Igoe, another former curator of the James Joyce Tower Museum, and together they are authors of a new book that's coming out next month called Tales from the Tower, about all of their experiences. And next to me is Breandan Breandan.
Not bad.
Yes. Who you were the editor of that fine book. The book will be available in October of 2023. I got to read it in order to talk to these wonderful people. And let me tell you, it is a brief but fantastic catalog of memories about this wonderful singular building. I can only see it being the go-to resource for historians and Joyceans alike going forward. There's nothing else like it. Welcome to the show, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. I've kind of gathered some different questions and things that people might want to know about your experience and about the tower. And I was wondering if we could start off by asking some very specific and wonky questions about the tower on June 16th, 1904, in the fictional version of Dublin that was in Ulysses. As you all know, you have the first line on your T-shirt, gentlemen, in the first row. So, the Ulysses opens with Stephen Dedalus, Buck Mulligan, and the English student Haynes staying here in the tower. And Stephen is very annoyed because Haynes has been having dreams of a Black Panther. And one question I've gotten a couple of times is, what is the truth? Is there any truth to that story about Haynes's, he would have been Dermot Chenevix's trench in real life. Is there any truth to that story, or is it completely made up by Oliver St. John Goger, the real life model for Buck Mulligan? Or is it somewhere in between?
Possibly somewhere in between, because Joyce mentioned it first in 1922. And Gogarty then gave us a much fuller account. And Gogarty, as we know, was great at spinning yarns. So I don't know, there may be some germ of truth in there, which has been happily embellished by Gogarty.
Okay. Because I know one question, I think there's a version of the story where a pistol was fired in the tower. Do you think there's truth to the pistol?
If not a pistol, maybe a revolver.
Okay.
A young student came here the other week. He was, I'm a volunteer here as well. And he asked a very kind of awkward but perspicacious question. He looked at me and said, "Show me the bullet holes."
I've been asked that many times.
I've been asked that too.
And I said, go and find bullet holes in granite.
Okay. All right. So you wouldn't find bullet holes in granite. You can take that to the bank.
Banging and pinging.
Well, it also, I heard that maybe the same revolver that Trench had was the revolver he used a few years later to shoot himself.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, he did come to a very young and tragic end.
He did.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So thank you. Another one, I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but I got a question over Instagram asking, why did Stephen not pay the milkwoman for her milk? Because later on he gives some money to Mulligan. Why didn't he give it to the milkwoman?
He didn't like wasting his money, I suppose.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
No, maybe Mulligan was officially the one who was paying the rent. There's a lot of doubt about that.
Okay.
And maybe he was the one she listened to. So.
Okay, so no justice for the milkwoman in Ulysses. She has to wait till next time to get some of her debt paid.
I think that was probably the modus operandi of half the people in Ulysses.
Yes, that is fair. I think it's in the next episode where Stephen remembers his own list of debts that have gone unpaid. Okay, great. Well, all right, we've got now all of our wonky literary questions out of the way, so I want to talk about your experience here as curators. Vivien, you were the first curator, and remind me, in what year did you begin as curator of the
In
tower?
1965 started, yeah.
1965.
The museum actually had opened in 1962,
Mhm.
and it fell into financial difficulties and was taken over by the tourist board. And then that's when I started.
Okay, and we have these wonderful, commodious facilities here now. Certainly, it was like that in the mid-'60s as well. Lots of nice climate-controlled rooms and indoor plumbing.
It was completely different. There was no plumbing whatsoever. The only water was the water running down the walls. There's nowhere to make tea or wash your hands. There's no loo, so you had to be house trained.
Okay, all right. A bit more Spartan back
No,
in
it
those
was very
days.
Spartan, and I had to climb up a big iron stairway, and sometimes nobody called in, and the wind used to be howling around the place.
Mhm.
And there was rumours going around that there was a strange character in the area, and there was no telephone, so you couldn't phone anybody. I had no typewriter, I had nothing.
Okay.
But I stuck it out.
I'm sure as part of curating a museum like this, you've met a lot of interesting and important people over the years, people that Joyce would have known. Are there any that really stand out in your mind as notable people that you were able to meet through the Joyce Tower?
Well, there were a lot of notable people,
Yes.
a lot of poets, writers. For example, I met John Berryman, the American poet, and he came in with a photographer from London, and I was sitting at the desk and he said, "What are you reading?" I said, "I'm reading a poem by Rivers Carew." So he took up the book and he went into the middle of the room and he started reading the poem. At the same time, the Dublin Literary Tour coming in the door, and they all stood around and watched John Berryman read the poem. They thought it was kind of part of the show, and he felt he was doing so well when he finished reading the poem. He took up another book from my desk and he read out some of Yeats, and he got a standing ovation. So they all thought it was part of the show. So
Right, fantastic.
he was just one of the people, and I'm sure.
Oh, he had a star-studded existence here. And you never knew who would turn
I
up.
remember seeing names like Bono and Salman Rushdie when I read the book.
Yes, well,
But those are not even the most interesting ones, I think.
tell that to Bono.
I mean, Bono's all well and good, but you got to meet Richard Ellman, who is someone whose work I've really admired just working on my podcast.
So, well, we both did, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
we both
Yes.
met Richard Ellman.
Yeah.
Yes, well, he was quite a charmer, really. He was over in Dublin doing a lecture, and so I went to see him and said, "You will come out to the tower, won't you?" So he came out and we had a good chat, and he sent me a few more photocopies of letters, which I thought would be useful to have here. And so we kept up a bit of a correspondence. And when he was writing the second edition of his book, I was able to supply him with some interesting tips. I'd met a lady whom Joyce had persuaded out of having an abortion.
Oh, wow. Okay. Is that a story you're willing to go into more? Or?
Well,
You don't have to.
Somebody had pointed me in her direction. She was a niece of Paul Leon, and she was an actress. And she's doing very well in London, and she just landed a great part. I think it was As You Like It. And there was one small problem, which is obviously going to get bigger, that she'd
Right.
become pregnant. And so she decided the best place to go was Paris and get it sorted out. So she went off to Paris, and when she was there, she met her uncle, and he and Joyce took her out for the night, and I think she had to carry them home at the end of it, but they persuaded her to have the child, and he went on to become a prominent architect.
All right.
Yeah, you met all sorts of people with all sorts of problems, and you had to listen to them. Then a nun used to come in and see me, and she was wondering should she stay in the convent or not, and she asked me why should she leave.
What did you tell her?
Based on what?
So you almost have like the job of a bartender or a therapist. Oh my gosh, I would not have expected that.
No, you get people with all sorts of problems.
And so one thing I want to ask you, your story kind of alluded to, you were able to meet people who had known Joyce.
Oh yes, a lot of them.
Yeah.
Like C.P. Kern, met Padraig Collum, Arthur Parr, Paul Ruggiero, a whole lot of them. I met them all.
Okay.
And of course, James Joyce's sister, May Monaghan, met her as a...
All right. Do you remember any stories about people who knew Joyce, or a story I've never heard before, Robert? You've told already. But were there any other things you learned about Joyce's life through these, friends and family of his?
Well, I knew his niece, Bosena della Mata, who was very exotic and quite a colourful character. And she used to come in and she used to tell me about when she met Lucia Joyce, and Lucia Joyce stayed with her, and she told me a lot about Lucia Joyce, and she used to talk about Lucia Joyce and Uncle Jim. Quite a lot.
Yeah, right.
Yes, and I was fortunate enough to get a trip to Paris to go and to see some of the ones who are still left in 1980. And so I had Samuel Beckett, for instance, who was very kind and friendly. And this was among the things he told me were just the little details about Joyce. There was that book by which Lucia had done, the Chaucer ABC, where she'd done all the illuminated letters. And he remembered Joyce going over it and he was trying to remember the word. He said, not his telescope, his loupe, magnifying glass. And he was looking at these letters and saying, I see no sign of mental illness in these designs. He's obviously clutching at straws there.
Yeah.
And he told me about the last time he'd seen Joyce and how they'd met down in Vichy, in the safe area. And then he'd finally looked in the door and he was leaving, and he walked down the road and he was turning back to wave goodbye at Joyce and Nora. And he said, I never thought it'd be the last time I'd see him.
And then I met James Farrell from Chicago. He wrote the Studs Lonigan trilogy. He's a very famous American writer, and he was child of a family of 16, and he was born in 1904. So he came over to see Benedict Kiley, and they both came out. And James, I took him all around Dublin, and when he came up to the Tower, he always brought his portable typewriter. I don't know why he carried it around with him all the time, but he did. But one time he was coming out from the stairs, the top of the stairs, and I was just in front of him, and he tripped. So he came tumbling down, but I caught him. So he said I saved his life.
Did you save his typewriter?
And the typewriter.
Oh, and his typewriter. Very important, yes. But we became great friends, and he invited me over to New York, and he said I could stay for as long as I liked.
All right.
Somebody else who was born in 1904, actually. I also met in Paris, was Nino Frank, who was Joyce's translator. And he told me the story of the Déjeuner Ulysse, which was a big photograph of there. And I think it's widely known that Samuel Beckett was left behind on the way home because he kept trying to go into bars for more drinks. And eventually said he wanted to go to the toilet, so they just dumped him by the side of the road. There was actually more to the story than that. Frank told me that while they were all sitting around listening to long and boring speeches from the French literary lions, They looked out the door of the restaurant, big window, and outside was a children's playground. And there was swings and seesaws. And so himself and Beckett, and I think Thomas McGreevy as well, slipped out and started playing on the swings and seesaws while the speeches are going on. And the next thing they realised was that Joyce had spotted them, and he slipped out and joined them as well. So he was on one of the seesaw and Nino Frank on the other. Everybody else in the party was furious. So they bundled them all on the bus to go home. And then again, it might have been McGreevy's idea to sort of say, oh, we need a facility stop. There's a handy pub here. So the three of them slipped out for a drink, and then again Joyce joined them. And the people in the bus were getting very agitated. They managed to pull off this trick a couple of times, and then eventually the moment came when Beckett said, folks, actually I really need to go to the toilet now. With one voice they all said, no! Plead, and suddenly was just dumped by the side of the road. Left her footed back to Paris.
Okay. All right, fantastic stories, thank you. A big part of being a curator, of course, is expanding the collection. Do you have any particularly favorite or memorable items that came into the collection during your tenure?
Well, when I first came, there's only 5 showcases. They're quite small, they're all full. So there were a few interesting things like the waistcoat, which is inside.
Yes.
It was Joyce's father. Samuel Beckett gave it to the tour. And then a lot of writers used to come in, they used to give their books when I asked them, and I kind of held a gun to their head.
Trenches gone.
Literally. And then Fritzen, he's a very well-known international Joycean who's based in Zurich. He was a friend of Joyce's, intimate friend in Zurich, Paul Ruggiero. And he told Ruggiero about the lack of material in the tower. So Paul Ruggiero, at least Fritz, invited me over to Zurich, and I went over and I met Paul Ruggiero, who was a very generous man, and he gave a very valuable collection, including Joyce's guitar and the first edition of Dubliners, which was signed, which Joyce signed and gave to Paul Ruggiero and his wife Bertha for a wedding present. And he gave a number of postcards and letters and Joyce's cigar cases and other things like that. And that was really the start of the collection, and it was very valuable. And he could have sold that collection for a huge amount of money, but he didn't. He gave it to the tower.
Excellent, fantastic.
Very generous. And
I suppose, well, the thing I felt was the real gap when I arrived was the first edition of Ulysses, which is, the reason why we're here. And so just very fortunately there was a man who said he had a copy for sale and was prepared to offer it for what, well, I won't give the figure, but by present day terms it was extremely generous. And so we managed to get a sponsor to pay for it. Actually, it was Carroll's, the tobacco company, provided the sponsorship, so I'm afraid it's got a slightly smoky past. And though actually I was talking to the man who sold it to us, and I think he managed to fund buying it in the first place by selling weeds.
Okay, interesting.
It was back a bit. I think it's actually, reportedly it's the one which Janice Rose, the Joyce scholar, used when he was working on the team for the corrected text of Ulysses as a kind of reference, a first edition to work from. So it's performed its function in Joyce scholarship.
Do we want to talk about the saga of the Death Mask, or should we save that for when they read your book?
Maybe save it to when we read the book.
Okay, so
Yes.
the Joyce's Death Masks have a very interesting history, but you got to read the book. We don't want to give everything away.
Just in passing on that, though, without commenting, because obviously it is a highlight of the book and a very significant part of the whole history of the curators. But it seems to me to cast the curators almost in what I began to think of them as editors, almost like they were guardians of the tower. And like they were prepared to fight to hold on to what they thought and knew was best for the tower, and really go against the prevailing feeling of power and men with money, and stuck out, and we owe them a serious debt for, if you like, so doing. Stuff could have vanished.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I took away from reading the book is how a lot of the curator's job is just cataloging things, how things come into the museum, and they don't necessarily get cataloged right away, and you have a lot of stuff, and you have to find out where it fits, and it just seems like a huge job.
It's more than cataloguing books, really.
Yeah. Okay.
Much more.
Yes.
So sometimes if you met somebody and they were really very interested in finding out about Joyce's Dublin, maybe after work, you'd take them around Dublin, which wasn't really part of your job, but you kind of enjoyed it and they enjoyed it, and you made great friends. And one time I was in the Tower, and this American bought 2 copies of Ulysses, and he came over and he said, "I wanted to sign these." And I said, "I didn't write the book."
Now you tell us.
And he said, "I wanted to sign it nevertheless."
How did you as a curator balance the needs of the tourism industry, which is how money can come into the tower, with the needs of being a scholar, a curator, or even a guardian of the tower, if you accept that description?
I suppose we both had that to put up with. I mean, the fact is, no museum survives on being solely commercial. If it did, it's probably prostituting itself in some way.
Okay.
And so we were fortunate, I suppose, that we had a company who looked after us, but they were a tourism organisation, and the priority would be tourism and making money. And sometimes, I think most of the time, they were quite understanding of the fact that the museum also had to be run responsibly, that I had to spend a lot of time doing cataloguing and research and things like that.
But that was easy enough, because initially the tower was only open, say, from May until the end of October, so you had the winter months to do your research.
Well, that was fine until I got a second job.
Oh.
And when they opened up the Dublin Writers' Museum, yes, rest in peace, I found that once the tower closed in the summer, I was sent back to the Writers' Museum and had to work there, so it kind of cut out the time for dedicated winter projects.
Okay. And I remember too from your sections, Vivien, you said certainly in the 1960s, in the early days of this museum, that most of your visitors came from overseas, and it took a while to kind of cultivate an interest in the tower in Ireland itself, which I found very surprising.
It took decades. No, initially it was just Americans and Europeans, very few Irish. Even on Bloomsday, very few Irish came. One man, Professor Roger McHugh from University College, he came every Bloomsday without fail. But other times on Bloomsday, nobody would be coming, only Americans. And, it was very quiet. The Irish sort of looked upon Joyce with suspicion, and they thought he was anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. So they just weren't too interested in Joyce.
Yes, I think that began to change really around probably 1977, the Joyce Symposium then, and of course David Norris, who was so prominent about saying, Joyce is fun, and reading him well. And then what really made the difference was the centenary in 1982, because so much was laid on that appealed to the local public. And I think it just brought up this idea of Bloomsday as a central, sort of an alternative to Christmas. So much you could do.
After, when the Ulysses film came out around 1966-67, there were very scurrilous and derogatory letters to the editor of the papers about the film and about Joyce, even about the Cannes Film Festival, saying people over there thought, the film was a bit dodgy.
Yeah, no, the story with the film at Cannes resulted in a man being pushed down the stairs. It was quite dramatic. We did an episode about that on our podcast, so you have to listen to that. But yeah, no, it was really surprising to me that I kind of knew it took a while for Joyce to gain popularity in Ireland, but it was surprising to me that it took that long.
Yes, I think when I started, people, the idea that Ulysses was something dirty was beginning to wane.
Mm-hmm.
They still thought it was something that was just for the Americans, and you could there were very few actual Joycean scholars in Ireland at the time. Vivien being one of them, of course. Roland McHugh, Roger McHugh, but it was, and David Norris, of course. But you could still count them on the fingers of two hands.
Right.
But when I was working here in 1965, I closed up the museum one day and I was going home down by the 40 foot, and I met somebody from UCD. She was the head librarian in UCD, and I'd studied librarianship. And she met me, and I was delighted to tell her about my new job up in the tower. And she looked at me between the two eyes and she said, "Miss Veale," she said, "you are working in the sewage museum. You should be absolutely ashamed of yourself."
This is a comment on the plumbing, obviously.
Yes, if only. Yeah, it's just it's hard. Like having gone to the Bloomsday celebrations the last couple of years since I've lived in Ireland, it's hard to I understand it intellectually, but it's hard to square how much has changed. And obviously,
completely. Yeah.
you guys have played such a big role in that. Coming here as an American, being able to come to the tower that's in the book is amazing. And
Yes, I don't know. Sometimes I feel a bit like Dr. Frankenstein.
okay.
Just encouraging Bloomsday in the first place, and it's become such a monster now.
Oh, that's quite a controversial statement. Do you want to speak to that? I was going to ask a bit about Bloomsday, Sophie.
Yes, well, I suppose I watched it grow from. In the beginning, it was probably much more esoteric, and
Okay.
a few people who knew what was what would sort of do quotations to each other and go and meet in the right places. And of course, there was the famous 1954 Bloomsday when they went out in the horse cabs, and I think it kind of set a template for all Bloomsdays to follow. That it involved a journey which never quite succeeded, and going to various places Joyce might have known, and stopping at a great number of pubs.
Okay.
And then eventually the shipwreck of the Odyssey. But I think that gives people something to follow. But it was, that was 1982, as I said before, just kicked it off rather. That RTE did the entire broadcast of Ulysses, which lasted 30 hours. And they put up speakers in various public places so people couldn't miss it. And so I think a lot of people just realised the fun. The other thing that happened on that day was the staging called Oh Rocks. It was they restaged the entire Wandering Rocks chapter of Ulysses on location according to a strict timetable, which I think Clive Hart had worked out. And so no one person could see the whole performance. It was everywhere. I had a very small part. I managed to get away from the tower long enough to be the Reverend Hugh C. Love being shown around the chapter house of St. Mary's Abbey by candlelight.
Nice.
And fortunately, actually, I claim credit for the suggestion. Trying to find out who would do the Viceroy, and I suggested that the Lord Mayor had the carriage and he could well be persuaded. So he did the procession through the middle.
Okay.
Then the Ormond Hotel very rashly announced that they were going to be selling drink at 1904 prices for 1 hour on Bloomsday. So, of course, everybody converged on that part of Dublin, including the people who'd been in the cast. And so they were all dressed up in Joycean costumes. And so I think people then got the idea it would be great fun to be roaming around the streets in Joyce costumes. So this kind of gradually grew and grew.
So it was an organic thing then, Bloomsday. It sort of it took on a life of its own. It was never like planned out in its current
No,
form.
nobody sat down and said, we shall make this a festival.
It made itself.
Board
a festival.
Fulcher didn't ask for a plan.
Okay.
It just simply mushroomed. And
Well, in 1967, at the first symposium, when Fitzem was here, he said to me later, Vivien, I don't know. We didn't know then what we were about to unleash. He never said a truer word.
Okay. Yeah. I wonder if in 200 years people will still do all the Bloomsday rituals but not know why they do them.
Like Christmas.
Yeah.
I think so. Look at the church.
Do you folks partake in Bloomsday yourself, or do you stay home that day? You don't have to say anything self-incriminating.
Well, the weather's generally very nice, so you go out and partake.
See, well, for so
Does
many
it
years,
involve
I had only one
gorgonzola?
thing to do
And
on
so many
Bloomsday.
things on, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But a very interesting thing was up in the old church in Taney in Dundrum, they got the bells from Hardwick St George's Church, and they actually play the bells up there on Bloomsday, so you can actually hear the bells that Bloom heard on Bloomsday.
But you asked, like, will people kind of remember what they're doing? Hard to say, but like last Bloomsday, I was upstairs 8 o'clock in the morning, and people were starting to read, and a man read a bit in English, and a man read a bit in Irish, and the lady read a bit in Polish, and they all believed.
I found when I was here, I was at the tower on the centenary in 2022, and it did have a mass-like quality to it. I couldn't say exactly why. Obviously, a lot of differences, but there was sort of, and I think in 2022 especially, a lot of people came from out of town who would normally be here, but there was a sort of an odd hush that fell over the crowd when the first reading began at 8 a.m. sharp on the 16th.
Yes. I know when we were reconstructing the round room as to how it originally looked, and I made a very special point of putting the table right in the centre of the room where the church would have put it.
Okay. All right. I'm trying to think how I want to ask this question. So I think, when prior to Ulysses being in the public domain, did you ever have any problems with copyright doing these sort of recreations of Ulysses or in various forms?
I think a lot of other people did. We, I think, got away with it. Barry McGovern had been started doing readings from Ulysses on Bloomsday here, and so every year he'd come and do yet another chapter on top of the tower, and so he took the view that, as I think outlined in the legal loophole, that it was in fact a performance which had started while copyright had been suspended, and that therefore it was allowed to be completed. And so we went on that way. I know I had a chat with Stephen Joyce on one occasion.
He's watching you from the photo right there. Be careful what you say.
I think he said, "You will do what you always do at the tower on Bloomsday." I think it was understood.
Was knowing him in person similar to the kind of prickly reputation that he has?
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose I thought about him a lot. I think you have to understand his situation. He told me that the first time he met me that all his family papers had been snapped up and sold into slavery in the United States, and that everybody else was talking about his grandfather and putting up the picture of him. He was being deprived of possession of his family. And I think the only thing he could do as head of the state was try and reclaim it in ways which, I mean, he didn't like biographers.
Okay.
He never felt they got his grandfather right.
Okay.
So it was a hard case, and I suppose I was always sorry I couldn't please him, but tried hard. I think a lot of people do. It's like walking a tightrope.
Right, yeah.
Once you fall off, you can't get up again.
But the James Joyce Institute, we went to Paris, I think it was 1988 or sometime, and Stephen Joyce, met us there, and he treated us very well, and was very hospitable.
Oh yeah, he's generous like
Good.
his grandfather.
Yeah.
He had the style.
All right.
But yes, I can see he did sort of hang a bit like a cloud over the
Mm-hmm.
street. I know I had difficulty. I wanted to publish another edition of my book, just I think shortly before copyright ran out, and the estate kind of destroyed that by charging a fee so enormous that we wouldn't have been able to sell the books.
Would that be a Ulysses Guide?
Yes.
Yeah, which is a fantastic book. Should be in everyone's collection. If you don't mind me tooting your horn a little bit.
Don't mind somebody else blowing that trumpet for me.
All right. Let me see how we're doing on time. I guess I want to return before we start finishing up here is to more practical matters of what were some of the challenges in operating what was originally a military fortification as a museum, just facilities challenges. I know you mentioned the water running down the
There's
walls.
no facilities when I was here.
Okay. I guess I'm thinking of the tower as its own
It
facility.
was just very damp.
Just very
so
damp.
It's difficult. Every winter I had to take out all the eggs. It was too damp to leave things here. So every winter I'd have to pack everything up and bring it away, and then bring it back again in May. So that was kind of a bit of a nuisance.
Was that almost one of the more tragic times of the tower, where I think I remember you writing about a visitor's book on a very special occasion, was put into safekeeping and never...
No, there were two visitors' books in 1962 when the tower first opened. It was opened by Sylvia Beach, and it had the signatures of everybody who came, like Sylvia Beach, Maria Jolas, and Frances Steloff, and Joyce's sisters, and everybody. And that was put in storage for the winter, and somebody dumped them.
Oh.
It was a really terrible waste of...
An officious office keeper, I suppose.
Yes.
Busybody.
Yes, I mean, they probably didn't
You
believe
know,
in keeping
It was
old
so
files.
valuable, this information.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking to hear.
It was heartbreaking, really.
Yes, I think that's why I was very anxious before I moved out to make sure that I registered as much as possible and kept all the files safe, because some of them are probably quite forgettable, sort of tour bookings and so on. There's an awful lot in there, letters from interesting people and inquiries and revelations and information, which some...
And then when Michael Scott's house was for sale, I did a big plan that we should buy that house, move the museum in there and leave the tower empty. And an American, George Linewall, offered his collection free of charge if that was undertaken, and we couldn't get the money to do it, so one of the best private collections of Joyce in the world was sold to the Southern Methodist University for a huge price, and we could have got it for nothing.
So I suppose what they did do, possibly as a result of that, was at least to build this extension we're setting in, so the museum itself got more space, even if it didn't actually get the Linewall collection. But it did give me room to start expanding the collection when I moved in. In fact, we needed every inch we got.
Yeah, I recall from your book too, I think the floors in the tower itself had to be fully replaced at some point because of, was it incursion of damp or water or things like that?
Yes, in 1972 there was a very generous man called Tom Keating who engaged when there was announced that the tower was closed because there was the environment wasn't good for it. He engaged to repair it all at his own expense. So he came along and put in a damp course. He said they actually drilled into the walls and it was like a huge reservoir. The walls had just filled up with water.
Oh my God.
Gallons and gallons and more gallons jetted out and
Oh my God.
released it all. because, as you can see, it relies entirely on pointing to keep the water out,
Yeah.
and pointing in itself isn't sufficient, short of actually covering it in plastic or something. It's always going to leak.
Okay.
And so in the course of that, I think he also decided that the floor upstairs was unsafe, and so that was replaced as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, we're very grateful for the condition it's in today. It's again hard to imagine the past because this is such a nice space to be in nowadays, except for that windy staircase up there. I don't like that staircase. But what can you do? It's history.
You get used to it.
There you go. You get used to it.
Yeah, you get used to it.
Well, with our remaining time, so I have one more question for you. So you guys have a book coming out called Tales of the Tower, which again, 2 thumbs up from me. But would you like to just talk about your book a little bit? What went into it? Anything that comes to mind.
Like people we met, for example, one day I was sitting up there and the student came in. He'd cycled out from Dublin on his bike, and he came in and he came up the stairs. And when he paid his shilling, he plonked a door knocker on my desk, and he said, "This is the door knocker for number 7 Eccles Street." So I said, he'd actually taken it off the door. The house had been demolished, so he saved it. So I asked him would he give it to the museum. He said, "I want to take it home and show the folks back home, but I'll eventually give it back to you." And 47 years later, he came back and at the James Joyce Institute, at the James Joyce Centre, he presented it 47 years later.
Presented the door from 7 Eccles Street. and
Right.
what
So the
reunite the knocker with
was
the door.
back on the
Oh
door.
my God.
He said it was a bit like River Run, go round
Yes.
or Finnegan's Wake.
Or Odysseus making his final return home. Yeah, it found Ithaca in the end. Did you want to talk at all about editing the book?
To say it was kind of a labour of love is a bit of an understatement. I think kind of what grew out of it, like for me, was this emergence of a third character almost, and that's the physical property that is the building itself. And why did I think that? It's because of the, if you like, the affection and the determination and the professionalism that these 2 people on my left put into putting up with the shit that was going on, if you like, in terms of its logistical kind of situation. For that it became, for them, a kind of a living place. And I think it's got a huge realism in that. We call it Tales from the Tower. At one stage, I was tempted to call it Curators because the book was a tribute to our curators. And it had been the intention of Seamus and the people involved to celebrate the curatorship of Vivien and Robert. But I think the publisher looked at it and thought there's about 222 curators in the entire world, so that's going to be a relatively limited sort of market. We wisely didn't do that. Another one I thought was Living with James, which was kind of an interesting kind of feeling as well. But we came to Tales from the Tower, and if I was to change it, it would only be to change one word. And I think in retrospect, Tales by the Tower might actually be a more accurate or succinct kind of way, because in the book what comes through is we have, if you forgive me for saying it, a dead author. We have a static, if you like, book, but we do have a living tower. And I think that's where what the publication Tales from the Tower is kind of cementing, if I can use that word, that this is not a dead museum by any manner of means. And it's becoming, as people more and more come in through the volunteers, through the visitors. Again, your question, 200 years, my vote is that it will be here. And that's what I liked about doing the book.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much. We've got a few minutes left here. I'd love to do a little Q&A. So does anyone in the audience or also from the live stream have any questions they'd like to ask these folks?
Hey, I just have a question for Vivien. There's a lovely piece in the collection which is a fragment of Nelson's Pillar, I understand that you collected that. Can you tell us a little bit of that, about the background of that?
I'm going to jump in here. The audience is not mic'd, so we should make sure to repeat the questions. So the question is for Vivien. There's a fragment of Nelson's pillar in the other room there. Could you talk a little bit about that?
No, when the pillar was blown up, I decided I'd go in immediately and pick up a bit of the pillar because it's cited, Nelson's pillar is cited 12 times in Ulysses. I thought it'd be good to have a piece of pillar in the tower as an exhibit.
And there it remains.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Anybody else?
Just a very quick one. Was there anything in the downstairs part of the tower when you originally opened the museum, or even in the 80s before the extension was built?
So, was there anything in the tower when the museum first opened?
Not in 1965. It was just a storeroom, and it was there. Yeah.
Okay.
Until I put an art exhibition by an Australian, Veale Harford. She did paintings of all the episodes from Ulysses, so
Okay.
I had an exhibition there, and that was the only thing that was ever. It's just a storeroom, really.
Yeah, so when it was when the extension was built then in 1979, when I moved in, it gave me another extra room to work with.
Okay. Yeah, you can always use some.
Half a room anyway. They repartitioned it.
Okay.
But there was also a toilet put in at that stage.
Okay.
Lucky you.
I spent hours in there.
Okay. Save that for the book. Anybody else, or any questions from the live stream there, Dermot?
Not seeing any on the live stream.
They're just listening politely, I'm assuming. Okay. Go for it.
I'm just wondering, given the tower today, the state it's in, looking back over your time in it, if money wasn't an issue, what would you like to see it be, or what would you like to see added to it or changed, if anything?
All right. It's just to repeat the question. Yeah. If money wasn't an issue, what would you like to see done or changed on the tower?
Golly, money was always an issue.
You want me to be honest?
Yeah, we want you to be honest.
I'd knock down the extension, and I'd have the tower as it was originally.
Okay.
And I'd buy the house, Michael Scott's house, and I'd put everything in there, all the exhibits, and I'd leave the tower as it was, and I'd put back the old staircase. If money wasn't enough.
Great answer.
You have a question on here?
All right. Before we get to that, did you have anything you want to add, Robert?
No, I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. We've got a question from the live.
How Linda McKee wants to know, how can we pre-order the new book?
How can we pre-order the new book? They want to read your book. How can they do it?
Martella Publishing, they will take orders in the next week or two on the site, so that's the simple answer to that. We're hoping for publication, the book will be delivered about the mid-October, and we're hoping to launch late last week in October, first week in November with Exeter.
Okay, fantastic. And anyone here at the tower, please email me as this stuff comes up, and I will push it out on our social media, and I'll put out our newsletter as well. So with that information in it.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yes, Vivien, the waistcoat from Samuel Beckett, how did you hear about that, and how did it arrive, and did you open it or not?
It had already arrived when I arrived.
Oh, okay. All right. So,
Yes,
so
I suppose you have
predates.
to
Yeah.
pay some tribute to the people who put the original collection together and opened up the tower in 1962. Michael Scott owned it, and John Ryan, who was the secretary of the Joyce Tower Society, and
Niall Montgomery was a member, and John Ryan, yeah, she mentioned.
Eamon Morrissey was one of the people who worked here. And Michael Hartnett was one of the early curators.
Yeah.
Do you have any memories of Michael Hartnett? As my co-host Dermot is quite a fan of Michael Hartnett, so we were wondering if you had any memories of him.
I only met him once, and unfortunately he was under the weather at the time, but he did identify me and what I did and inform me that he had done the same job as me many years before.
Okay.
I met him once up at the Francis Ledridge Museum. He was giving a lecture, and I found him a very nice, charming man. And
Fantastic.
he was a very good poet as well.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Yes.
Just, it might be helpful to mention one thing. The museum has been taken under local management under the County Council, and the idea for the book arose among the friends of Joyce Tower as a way of paying tribute to the early curators at a time of transition, celebrate what had been contributed by them as we embarked on a new phase. And the museum is now on a sound financial footing under the local county council,
Okay.
which is an important development.
All right.
And also, the volunteers who looked after the museum for 12 years, they're also to be thanked for
Okay.
keeping the museum open.
Yeah. I know something we talked about a little bit in an email Robert sent to me is let me see how I wrote this down about developing your skills as a Joyce expert on the job rather than being, an established Joycean,
Yeah, so I think both of us, entered with fairly modest qualifications, and because we were, in my case, I think because so many people asked questions, and it was very important that I knew the right answer, so I was obliged to research, and then I just sort of went from there. And of course, the place has a library, and plenty of time to read then. So I just began from there. And so it's funny to look back and think, when I began, I was probably how little I knew.
Yeah. I think too, one of the things since the volunteers did become involved, over 12 years now, the amount of knowledge that the volunteers have accumulated through their own efforts, through talking to each other, through having readings, is actually an extraordinary tribute to volunteerism as a, if you like, a social concept. And they are truly a precious jewel, I think, within the tower. What I would say, though, is that it is equally, or even more so, it's wonderful to have a new curator back in place, because there is only so much volunteers can actually do. And it needs a strong academic, an ongoing academic basis and a foundation. And the, volunteers with the best will in the world won't have the time, the capacity, or the information base, I think, in which to do that.
And it's great that Dr. Alice Ryan, she's actually a Joycean, who's the new curator,
Indeed.
so that's
Yes.
terrific.
So, I think there has been that kind of tremendous kind of development, I think, that's gone on. I mean, Robert had the issue of going out of a tower as volunteers were coming in. Alice has the responsibility and the difficulty, shall we say, of placing herself in the tower as the volunteers are there. So there is definitely a kind of a cross-fertilization that goes on now between the volunteers, between the curators. And I think that can materialise and do very well. Vincent Brown was one of the people who definitely sort of managed to get the volunteer system going, and probably was really the real progenitor of it. He kind of said as a kind of almost like a social revolution kind of thing, is that under volunteerism there would be no bosses. And that by and large has worked very well. The friends were friends. But now we are moving into a stage, and I think quite a rightful stage, where a more structured format will take place. We can't run the risk of amateurism, and I use that word very advisedly and very kind of, I am an amateur and delighted to be so. So it is that kind of wonders, again, this idea of where the tower goes in terms of what its target market is kind of, it can become, if you like, a place that creates access and makes access available and readily available and joyfully available. And I think more and more people will come to the tower and come to Joyce effectively through the facility being here.
Right. Absolutely. Robert or Vivien, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Trying to think what I could add to that. I suppose I spent many years with the Irish Museums Association, so I always had a great respect for the professional curator and the idea that a museum should be curator-led. So I think it's there's quite a challenge to working with volunteers. We have to get all the lines exactly right. And the volunteers are busy gathering and sharing information. It's important that the information is channeled through to the curator, who can then keep it and preserve it in the museum, as opposed to sending it out the door with the next shift.
All right. We could do one more question if we've got one.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were going to move to the evening, but go ahead.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we're gonna move to another exciting thing.
I'll do one last one if
Yeah.
no one else has one.
Go for it.
Like upstairs with the recreation in the round room of how it would have looked when the guys were here, was there any way, or was there ever any attempt made to contact Oliver St. John's family to see if they'd have anything left from the furniture he would have actually had here when he was staying here all those years?
Well, no, I did. I met the Gogarty family on various occasions. Gogarty said there was unmissed things from the home in Parnell Square. In Ulysses, it's things he's pinched out of the skivvies room. I don't think any of that furniture was important, and in any case, Gogarty, apart from having half his belongings put to the torch in Renvale House, he also moved to America, so there was very little left. I think actually, the one thing I remember Oliver D. Gogarty telling me was that his father never actually stayed in the tower after he got married in 1907, because his wife told him he would catch fleas from the pigeons. I think as a medical man he knew otherwise, but he was not to be argued with.
Brilliant.
There wasn't that much furniture anyway up in the round room.
No, as described. I mean, I had this job of trying to reconstruct it, and it was interesting itself. And there was Gogarty's description, there was also Joyce's description. I mean, Joyce describes the floor as flagged, which it wasn't. He also describes Trench's hammock, which had nothing to be slung from, until our helpful builders put a couple of steel bolts in the wall. I was not really very happy about that, but I think the idea was to present how it looked in Ulysses. But they were sitting on valises and trunks, as described in the book.
And when making the film of Ulysses, they just had a bed and a shelf and pots in it. And after the film, after they left the room the same for a few days with the bed in it. And visitors used to come in and they'd ask me, "Do you live here?"
Pretty much.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been just a fantastic discussion. We could probably talk for another hour about your memories, but you're going to have to wait till you get the book. So Tales from the Tower will be out next month. Martello Publishing. All right, look them up. Thank you so much, Robert Nicholson, Vivien, Veale, Igoe, Breandan, O'Brien. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.